Hello everybody, welcome to the first video of 2024. We're literally like 2 months in and I can't believe that this is the first video I'm going to be posting, but there are a couple reasons for that. The first being, I did film a video at the beginning of January for my 2023 reading wrap-up that I was going to post in the middle of January. However, the file got corrupted and unfortunately no matter what I tried, I could not figure out how to export the video unless I cut a lot of it out or redid it from scratch, which I wasn't going to do given how much time it took me. So I decided to scrap it. And as a result, I needed to take a little bit of a break. So that was a bummer. The second reason is because I've actually been obsessively binge watching K-dramas recently. I'm kind of, I guess, in that era of my media consumption. That's basically all I've been doing in my free time is just watching K-dramas. They're very, very addictive and I'm enjoying my time, so I can't really complain. But that does lead a little bit into the third reason why I haven't posted a video in a long time, and that is because I have not read any books outside of my own recently. Part of that is because the way that I'm consuming stories right now is just by watching K-dramas. But another reason is actually because I've been focused a lot more on my own writing. So I am currently writing a new book, and I'm also editing one of my oldest books that I have, which I'm not going to complain about at all because it's been a really long time since I've been able to focus on my writing this consistently, so I'm pretty happy with it. And unfortunately, reading your own books does not count towards any Goodreads goals, so technically I haven't really read a book this year. Which, a third reason for that is actually, this tends to be my habit. For whatever reason, I do not read a lot in the winter. I've been tracking my reading now for like 3 years. And basically the months from like January to March, I read like maybe a couple books. I don't know why winter seems like the time that you really should be reading a lot more because it's cold, it's usually crappy weather, so you're indoors a lot, but I just, for whatever reason, it's just like not my thing. So I actually haven't completed a book yet this year and we're literally towards the end of February. So not gonna be great for my reading goal at the end of the year, but whatever, I don't really care right now. I'm enjoying my life. So with that explanation out of the way as to why I have not posted a video in a long time, let's get into what today's video is going to be about, and that is tips I think can help you read more classics. So if you watched any of my reading videos from last year, you'll know that one of my main reading goals was to read genres that I don't typically read, and one of those was classics. I did end up reading 10 classics last year, which is like 10 more than I read in the last 10 years. So it was a very successful reading year from that standpoint, and I actually really enjoyed like almost all of the classics that I read. I had a great time reading, so I thought a lot about why it was suddenly like easier for me to read classics, or how I think people who don't typically read classics the way I used to be can kind of introduce more into their lives. So I have 6 tips that I think can help you incorporate more classics into your reading life. The first tip isn't very groundbreaking, and it is actually something that you can use to read basically more of anything, and that is just to pick short books. I think classics get a bad rap for being like super long and like full of info dumping and all that kind of stuff, but there definitely are titles out there that are shorter books that you can get through within like a day. 2 that I read last year that were under 200 pages was We've Always Lived in the Castle and Hound of the Baskervilles. They're both very short and pretty easy to read, so you can get through them relatively painlessly. The second tip is to pick easy ones. I feel like it's a little bit of a myth that all classics are very difficult to read. This is actually something that I kind of believed before I really dedicated to trying to read a lot of them last year, but there are actually ones that are like extremely easy to breeze through. One of those for me was And Then There Were None. This is the first Agatha Christie book that I actually ever read, and I devoured it. I literally read this within 1 day, which I have never done in my entire life. Usually it takes me, if I'm binge reading a book, it usually takes me 2, maybe 3 days to read, but this one I just like could not put down, and I literally finished it within like 6 hours. And part of that is because it is like extremely easy to read. A lot of it is just like dialogue, so you can like skim through it really, really quickly. It's very, very plain English, so there is no extra brain power that I needed to use in order to try and like decipher what it was that I was reading. It's just like a super quick mystery read. I haven't read another Agatha Christie book yet, so I don't know if the rest of her writing is like this, but this book in particular I would recommend as an easy book to start with if you want to try to like dip your toe into reading classics. My third tip might be a little bit of a taboo, but that is to watch an adaptation of the book before you actually try reading it. A few examples of these that I thought actually helped me to be able to read the book easier is Pride and Prejudice, Dune, and Dracula. All 3 of these books have pretty accurate adaptations out there. For Pride and Prejudice, I watched the 2005 movie a couple years ago, ended up really, really loving it, and have watched it multiple times since, and I think the reflective sides of this are like shining on my face. It's kind of funny. But I actually think watching that movie so many times really helped me to be able to get into the language that Jane Austen uses. So when I read the book, it was a little bit easier for me to get through it. There were still parts in this one in particular that I really struggled with sometimes, and I had to like work my brain over a couple of times to try and be able to understand what was being said. But I think it was still infinitely easier to read this one because I was so familiar with the movie. Dune is another great example. I watched the new movie, the one that came out during the pandemic. The newer one is a really, really good adaptation of the contents within this book. So when I started reading it, I didn't have to stop all of the time to look back at the appendix to try and figure out like what they meant by, you know, some of the spaceships that are in this or the different houses and races and that kind of stuff. So watching the movie before I tried to read this book made it easier for me to dive directly into the world because I was already familiar with the names of certain things. The pictures were already in my head because I had the movie to reference. And then Dracula, same thing. There are in the Bram Stoker's Dracula that has Gary Oldman in it. I watched that movie like 10 years ago or something like that, and literally some of the imagery from that book erupted back into my brain when I was reading this. So watching the adaptations that are true to the source material can really help you be able to like kind of merge the two, which I think can help make this an easier reading experience. And I will say, even though all three of these books that I just shared with you, I think the movies are authentic representations of the book, that doesn't mean that everything is the same. So you still get like a new experience when you're reading the book, even if you've seen the movie already, just because there are obviously things that they're going to have to change for the movie that'll just translate better to a like visual audience. Even though you'll be familiar with the story and like the characters and stuff like that, they'll still be like new experiences that you get while you're reading. So I don't think it'll ruin it by any means. But I will say the key to this tip is to get an authentic adaptation. If you have one that kind of betrays the source material or isn't really like the book at all, I don't think it's going to help as much. So try to find the movies or TV shows that like do a good job of sticking to the source material. My fourth tip is if you don't understand the language, don't sweat it. Just keep going on. Like skip it. Who cares? That sounds harsh and like very counterintuitive, but I think people, and myself included, let me backtrack and give you an example first. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is one of the most difficult science fiction books I have ever read. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is a novel about these people who live on the moon. So they have like a lunar colony and they're very oppressed by Earth. Like they're basically just there to mine, I think. It's been a long time since I've read this book, so I don't remember all of it, but they're basically just there to like mine things and deliver it off to Earth. So they're kind of like second-class citizens. They don't have a lot of rights. They don't have a lot of like resources for themselves. And it's also very dangerous because the moon is, while it's like safe for them to live there, the like lack of gravity and that kind of stuff, it causes sickness, and if they ever go back to Earth they can die because the gravity is so much heavier down there, and there's like not really a lot of green and that kind of stuff, so it's just bad living. And this book is about them basically having a revolution against Earth to try and get more rights for themselves. This book, I tried reading it a very long time ago, and then I decided to give it another shot, and it literally took me until I think page 240 for the plot to really pick up or for me to really find this book compelling. Why I read all the way to 240, I don't know. I can't tell you why I stuck it out that much because it was very, very difficult to read. And the reason it is so difficult to read is because the lunar colony has their own like dialogue. So they have a lot of phrases and like colloquial sayings that like only they can understand. A lot of the book has this, and the only reason why I was able to get to page 240 is because I stopped trying to understand what they were saying and I just kept going. And I genuinely do not think that that impacted my understanding of the book at all. I think it's a common misconception that you need to be able to understand literally every single thing that is said for reading comprehension to happen. This was something that I believed also. I was like, if I'm not taking in every single word of the story, then I'm like losing context for what's going on and I'm not giving the story its like due justice. But I don't actually think that that's true anymore. And it's partially because of this book, because I think, I don't want to say wasted my time, but if I had like kept trying trying to like understand every single line of dialogue that these people were saying to each other, I would have gotten frustrated and quit again, instead of like getting to the end and finding the compelling ending about how the revolution ended. And I wouldn't have learned like a kind of cool system for how this like rebellion built its like security systems and that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I would say for Pride and Prejudice and Dune as well, this is something that I kind of applied there, where I was like, if I was really struggling to like understand a specific scientific term, or if I just like didn't really get like a line of dialogue that somebody was saying in Pride and Prejudice, I didn't really sweat it. I was just like, whatever, I'll just keep reading and I'll get the context for what's going on in the following sentences that I can understand. However, that being said, my fifth tip is if you absolutely hate it, then just DNF it. Or start skimming it, where you're just like kind of breezing through the most important parts to get to the end. And this is something that I did with Brave New World. This is probably the only other classic that I've read in the last 10 years. I think I read it like 2 or 3 years ago, and I absolutely fucking hated it. This book is like, I know people love it, and I know that it has some interesting points on hedonism and consumerism, but it was god awful. I can't even put into words why I hate this book so much, because I hate it that much. I was supposed to read it for a book club. I got like halfway through it before I was like, I can't take this book anymore. So I just started skimming it. I would read like part of a page and then I would flip to another page until I like got enough context to understand how it ended and like why it ended that way. And if I hadn't done that, I would have literally just DNF'd it, because I like could not stand the writing. It literally felt like the author just like hated the youth and was taking out his bitterness in this like very black and white world that he built. It's a very racist book. I think it lacks foresight on like what actual characters would do in these types of situations. And also like the way that it ends is just like, what? I don't know. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about this book anymore. I just like, if you hate it, just DNF it, or like skim to the end and like figure out what you need to know about the book. My sixth tip is just to try different genres, which like that I think can go if you're like a new reader as well and you don't really know what it is that you like reading yet. Trying out every single genre is a good way to kind of find where your interests lie. I think that works with classics as well. Like I personally am mostly a fantasy, science fiction, and romance reader. However, if you'll notice, most of the classics that I held up were horror and mystery. I mean, there are a couple science fictions in here as well, and the one romance book in Pride and Prejudice, but I would say most of the classics that I read last year were either mystery, thriller, or horror novels, which I really do enjoy those genres as well. I just don't usually read them as much as I read science fiction and fantasy, but it turns out that maybe those are my niches in classic reading, because I had so much fun with like basically all of the ones that I read. Whereas I think the two science fiction novels that I did read that are classics, as much as I like do enjoy them, they're much more difficult for me to get through than some of the more modern science fiction books are, which I think take this with a grain of salt, because I am by no means an expert on classic fantasy and science fiction novels, but I do think that the trend used to be these big chunky books with like a lot of info dumping and world building that like makes them a little bit more tedious to get through. So those are 6 tips that I would give for anyone who wants to try to read more classics. If you enjoy reading classics as well and you have any other tips for newbies or people who just kind of want to expand their horizons in reading classics, please share them in the comments. Also, if you are a K-drama lover and have any recommendations, I would be super thrilled to get some, because I just finished my last one, which was A Shop for Killers. Highly recommend it, but I am looking for a new one to dive into. So that's it for today. See you next time.